The second I heard my father's voice on the other end of the line, I knew something was off. It wasn't just the way he spoke, sharp, direct, completely stripped of any warmth or small talk. It was what he actually said. "We're having a family meeting tomorrow. Your brother will be there too." My grip on the phone tightened, a sick feeling twisting in my gut. It had been years. Years since I'd last seen my brother, the man who had stolen my wife. The betrayal had left a wound that never fully healed, though I had done my best to live with it. I buried myself in work, rebuilt my life piece by piece, and told myself I had moved on. I convinced myself that their actions were ancient history, that I didn't care anymore. But the moment my father said those words, I knew that wasn't true. Because now, he was back. And so was she. I sat there in silence, the weight of it all settling on me. My father hadn't called to ask if I could make it. He was telling me to be there. This wasn't an invitation, it was an order. My fingers hovered over my phone, my mind screaming at me to refuse, to come up with some excuse. But I knew deep down there was no avoiding this forever. If my father had gone out of his way to call this meeting, it had to be serious. So, exhaling slowly, I forced myself to send a simple response. "I'll be there." The next evening, as I pulled into my father's driveway, memories came flooding back, sharp and relentless. The driveway, where I used to park next to my brother's car, the two of us laughing over stupid things. The porch, where I had stood with my wife, holding her close, believing we had a lifetime ahead of us. The front door, the same one I had slammed shut 4 years ago, swearing I'd never look back. And yet, here I was, about to walk through it again. Stepping inside, my heart pounded harder than I wanted to admit. The familiar scent of my father's cigars lingered in the air, laced with the faint trace of my mother's lavender perfume, a scent that still clung to the house even though she had been gone for years. Some things never changed. But some things did. Because as I entered the living room, I saw them. Sitting together. Acting like nothing had ever happened. My brother was sprawled back in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the side, that same cocky smirk on his face. He looked polished as always, pressed shirt, perfectly styled hair, a watch on his wrist that probably cost more than some people's rent. He had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. And yet, there he was, sitting right in front of me, the man who had taken everything from me. And then my eyes landed on her. My wife. Or at least, the woman who used to be. The way she looked at me made my stomach churn. It was the look of a cat that already had its prey trapped, a quiet, knowing amusement, completely unbothered. She let her gaze drag over me, slow and deliberate, before she smiled, as if I were just an old friend she hadn't seen in a while instead of the husband she had betrayed. "Still single?" my brother sneered, tilting his head. I felt my fingers twitch, my entire body coiled with the urge to wipe that smug grin off his face. But I didn't move. I refused to give him the satisfaction. And then she laughed. Soft, cruel, cutting right through me. "Hey, ugly. Still the same." I clenched my jaw, inhaling deeply through my nose. I had spent years preparing for this moment, convincing myself that if I ever saw them again, I wouldn't let them get to me, that I had outgrown their petty games. But standing here now, hearing their voices, seeing their faces, it was as if no time had passed at all. Before I could say a word, my father stood up. The room instantly fell silent. He had never been a man who needed to raise his voice to command attention. It was just something about him, his presence, his posture, the weight he carried. "Good timing," he said, his eyes moving between my brother and me. "I have something important to tell you." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. A heaviness. A finality. I glanced at my brother, and for the first time, I saw something shift in his expression. The usual smugness that clung to his face wavered, just for a second. My ex-wife sat up a little straighter, her fingers curling around the edge of the armrest. They hadn't expected this. And in that moment, I understood, this wasn't just another family meeting. This was something else entirely. My father turned without another word and walked toward his desk. He pulled out a thick envelope, moving with a deliberate steadiness, then placed it on the table between us. "This is my will." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It was almost tangible, an invisible weight pressing down on all of us. My brother's smirk disappeared completely, replaced with something I hadn't seen on his face in years, uncertainty. My ex-wife shifted slightly, her confidence cracking just enough to be noticeable. For the first time since I had walked into this house, she wasn't the one in control. "Dad," my brother said slowly, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "Why are we talking about this now?" My father's gaze didn't waver. "Because I don't have time to waste." The words hit like a hammer, each syllable carrying a weight I wasn't ready for. A cold feeling crept into my stomach. My father had always been a pillar of strength, the kind of man who never showed weakness, who never let the world see even the smallest crack in his armor. But as I looked at him now, something was different. The lines on his face seemed deeper, his frame thinner than I remembered. And in that moment, I knew. Something was wrong. My brother must have realized it too because he sat up straighter, his fingers tightening around the arms of his chair. His eyes flickered between me and our father, searching for answers. But my father wasn't going to give him the chance to ask. "I have something else to tell you," he continued, his voice still steady, still calm, but there was an edge to it now. A sharpness I felt before he even said the words. "I have terminal cancer. 3 months left." Silence. My brother's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. My ex-wife's smirk had completely vanished, replaced by an expression I couldn't quite read. For the first time since I stepped into this house, neither of them had anything to say. And in that moment, the past didn't matter. The betrayal, the anger, the years of bitterness, they all faded into the background. Because none of it was important anymore. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't thinking about my brother. I wasn't thinking about her. I was thinking about my father. And how little time he had left. The weight of his words settled on me, heavy and suffocating. 3 months. 3 months to make sense of something I wasn't prepared for. My father, the strongest man I had ever known, the one who had been unshakable through every storm, was dying. I swallowed hard and glanced at my brother. His face was unreadable, but I knew him too well. The subtle tightening of his jaw, the twitch of his fingers, it wasn't grief. He wasn't mourning. He was calculating. And her. My ex-wife sat beside him, her body suddenly stiff, her eyes darting between my father and the thick envelope on the table. She wasn't thinking about the man who had once treated her like his own daughter. She wasn't feeling the weight of his diagnosis the way I was. She was thinking about what this meant for them. I shouldn't have been surprised. My brother had always been the golden child, the charming, ambitious, untouchable one. No matter what he did, my father had always seen him as the son who could do no wrong. The eldest, the one meant to carry on the family name, to lead with pride. And me? I was the quiet one. The one who worked hard but never quite measured up, always overshadowed. And then, as if that hadn't been enough, he took the one thing that had mattered most, my wife. She and I had built a life together. We had made plans, had dreams, a future that I had thought was unshakable. I had believed we were happy. I had trusted her. But while I had been living in that illusion, they had been sneaking around behind my back, whispering their lies, building something of their own while I remained blissfully unaware. I had learned the truth the hard way. Even now, I could remember that night as if it had just happened. An ordinary evening, or at least, that's what I had thought. I had made dinner reservations at her favorite restaurant, planning to surprise her after a long day at work. But the real surprise had been waiting for me. I had planned everything. A quiet, thoughtful gesture. I made dinner reservations at her favorite restaurant, wanting to surprise her after a long day at work. I walked in, scanning the softly lit tables, expecting to see her waiting for me with that familiar smile. Instead, my eyes landed on something that froze me in place, her hand, wrapped around my brother's. Their laughter drifted through the room, light and intimate, the kind that came from something deep, something lasting. Something that had clearly been there for a while. I couldn't move. My body refused to react, my mind lagging behind, struggling to accept what my eyes had already seen. And then, as if she could feel me watching, she turned. And she didn't even flinch. No shock. No guilt. Just that lazy, smug smile. "Did you really not know?" she asked, tilting her head, her voice laced with mockery. Everyone else noticed. My brother barely looked at me. He let out a sigh, setting his glass down with an air of absolute indifference. "It's over. Let's not make this dramatic." Dramatic. As if my entire world hadn't just been torn apart in a single, gut-wrenching moment. The divorce had been brutal, not just because of the legal battle, but because of the sheer humiliation. My brother married her within months, parading their new life in front of me like a victory lap. Lavish vacations. Extravagant dinners. A house that should have been mine. And I walked away with nothing but whatever dignity I had left. Even that felt barely intact. And now, years later, they were sitting here in my father's house, still wearing that same smugness, still acting like they had the world at their feet. But something in the air told me, this time, things were going to be different. I took a slow breath, pushing the past aside as I focused on the present. My father cleared his throat, his gaze settling firmly on my brother. "There's something you need to understand," he said, his voice calm, but laced with finality. I saw it then, the way my brother's shoulders tensed slightly. "I built this family's wealth from nothing," my father continued. "I sacrificed. I worked. I bled to make sure you both had everything you needed. But there's a difference between needing something and feeling entitled to it." The room felt suffocatingly silent. My brother let out a forced, nervous chuckle. "Dad, come on. This isn't necessary. Don't interrupt me." The words sliced through the air like a knife. I watched as my brother's jaw clenched, frustration flickering in his eyes. He wasn't used to being shut down. He had always had a way of twisting things, manipulating people, making himself look like the victim. But not this time. "You betrayed your own blood," my father said, his voice like steel. "You humiliated your brother. You took what wasn't yours. And you did it with a damn smile on your face." My brother's smirk faltered. My father leaned forward, his next words slow, deliberate, final. "You don't deserve a damn thing." The change in my brother was instant. He sat up straighter, his entire demeanor shifting. His wife's fingers curled against the armrest, her expression tightening as her confidence wavered. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice sharper now, laced with something that almost sounded like panic. My father didn't blink. "It means you're both in for a very rude awakening." I didn't say a word. I just watched. For years, I had lived with the pain of their betrayal. For years, I had told myself that karma was nothing more than a fantasy, that people like them always got away with the worst of their sins. But now, sitting across from them, watching the first cracks of fear creep into their carefully crafted arrogance, I realized something. I had been wrong. And they were about to learn what it felt like to lose everything. The silence in the room thickened, heavy with unspoken truths. My father's words had landed like a hammer, shattering the illusion they had built for themselves. "You don't deserve a damn thing." I saw it, the flicker of doubt in my brother's eyes, the tightening of his jaw as he tried to process what was happening. His wife, usually so composed, so arrogant, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers tapping restlessly against her thigh. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. For years, I had carried the weight of their betrayal. I had swallowed the anger, the pain, the humiliation. But now, as I sat across from them, watching the first signs of fear take root in their perfect little world, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Satisfaction. My father leaned back in his chair, his eyes never wavering from my brother's face. Before we go any further, let's talk about something important, he said, reaching for a thick envelope from the desk beside him. I didn't need to ask what it was. I already knew. And judging by the way my brother's hands curled into fists, so did he. My father's will. This wasn't just another lecture. He wasn't here to scold us or make some empty statement. He was here to make it final. He set the envelope down on the table with careful precision. I want you to know exactly where my assets are going, he said, his voice just as steady as ever. Because some of you seem to think you have rights to things you don't deserve. I watched as my brother swallowed hard. His wife's smirk had vanished completely, replaced by something colder, calculating. She wasn't looking at my father anymore. She was looking at the envelope. Wait, Dad, why are we talking about this now? My brother finally spoke, his voice tight, strained. My father exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. Then he said the words that changed everything. Because I don't have time to waste. I have terminal cancer. 3 months left. The air in the room disappeared. My brother's spine went rigid, as if someone had yanked a cord and pulled him upright. His wife's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide, not in grief, not in sorrow, but in sheer, raw shock. My stomach tightened. I had already suspected something was wrong. The heaviness in my father's voice, the way his clothes seemed to hang a little looser, the exhaustion in his eyes. I should have seen it sooner. But hearing it out loud made it real in a way that punched the air from my lungs. 3 months. That was all the time I had left with the only parent I had. You never told us this, my brother muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. My father didn't blink. I didn't feel the need to. He looked between us, then straightened. But now that you're here, let's discuss what really matters. He walked back to his desk, pulled out another stack of documents, and laid them in front of us. These are records of all my financial transactions, my will, and something else. He paused, his gaze sharp. Records of what happened 4 years ago. I frowned. What was he talking about? My father tapped his finger on one of the documents. Do you know where you were when your mother was sick? A sick feeling crawled up my spine. Our mother, kind, selfless, always putting family first, had passed away not long after my brother's betrayal. I had been so consumed by my own pain at the time that I hadn't noticed much of anything. But I knew she had spent her last months in and out of hospitals, growing weaker by the day. My brother scoffed, shaking his head. Dad, come on. What does this have to do with anything? My father ignored him. These are bank statements, he continued. I sent you both money for her medical care. $5,000 a month. I turned to my brother just as his face twitched. A slow, creeping redness spread across his skin. But there's a problem, my father went on, his voice growing cold. No payments were ever made. Silence. My ex-wife stiffened beside my brother, her nails digging into the armrest. But my father wasn't finished. He pulled his laptop closer, typed something, then turned the screen toward us. There's more, he said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. A video started playing. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The grainy footage flickered on the screen, the timestamp blinking in the corner. And then, it hit me like a punch to the gut. A location. A date. And then, my brother and his wife. The footage was from 4 years ago. The night our mother had been struggling to breathe in her hospital bed. The night she had needed us most. They weren't with her. They weren't even home. They were at a luxury hotel. Laughing. Drinking. Celebrating. The room felt ice cold. I turned to my brother, waiting for an explanation. An excuse. Something. But for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, his skin draining from red to pale in seconds. His wife clutched his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve as she stammered, her voice just a little too sharp, a little too defensive. This is ridiculous. My father tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Is it? My brother slammed his hands against the table, his voice rising in frustration. You think this changes anything? What do you want from me, Dad? An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. Are we done now? My father didn't so much as flinch. His voice remained steady, controlled. No. We're far from done. I let out a slow breath, my mind racing. For years, I had convinced myself that my brother and his wife had taken everything from me. That they had won. But as I sat there, watching them crumble under the weight of my father's quiet, unwavering judgment, I realized something. They weren't as invincible as they thought. And this was only the beginning. The heaviness of my father's words settled over the room like a dense fog, suffocating and inescapable. My brother had always been skilled at twisting the truth, at bending reality to suit his needs, always making himself the victim. But now, he had no way out. No clever excuse. No manipulation that could undo the proof sitting in front of him. I glanced at my father, watching as he rested his fingers lightly on the stack of documents. He had never been one for theatrics. He didn't need to raise his voice or make a scene. When he spoke, people listened. And right now, my brother and his wife were terrified. You abandoned your own mother for money, my father said, his tone eerily calm. And then, as if that wasn't enough, you stole from me. I turned back to my brother, watching as his face twisted into something between panic and fury. That's not true, he spat through gritted teeth. I don't know where you're getting this, but it's. Don't lie to me. My father's voice was sharp, like steel cutting through air. He clicked a button on his laptop, and a new set of images filled the screen. Bank statements. Transactions. Records of lavish spending, each one perfectly aligned with the months our mother had been sick. Thousands of dollars, money meant for her medical care, drained from my father's account. And where had it gone? Shopping sprees. Luxury hotels. 5-star dinners. My ex-wife exhaled, shifting in her seat. This is ridiculous. What are you even trying to prove here? My father didn't even look at her. That I was blind. His voice was heavy, filled with something that almost sounded like regret. Blind to what you two really were. My brother let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. Come on, Dad. It's not like you're hurting for money. We didn't. You let your mother die alone. The words landed like a gunshot. I felt my chest tighten, my hands curling into fists at my sides. My mother had deserved better. She had deserved love, care, the presence of her family in her final days. But she had never gotten that. Because my brother had made sure of it. I had been drowning in my own grief, my own heartbreak, and I had assumed they were too. That they were just as lost, just as devastated. But now, sitting here, watching them, I realized the truth. They had never mourned. They had been celebrating. And something inside me snapped. Was it worth it? My voice was low, steady. My brother shot me a glare. Don't start. No, I want to know. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. When Mom was in that hospital bed, struggling for every breath. Were you happy? Were you laughing? Were you toasting to your new life while she was gasping for air? Shut up, he snapped, his jaw tightening. My ex-wife shifted in her seat, looking away. For the first time, she wasn't smirking. She wasn't throwing out cruel little jabs, wasn't trying to get under my skin. Because even she knew there was no excuse for this. My father exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples, as if this entire conversation was draining what little strength he had left. Finally, he let out a long breath and shook his head. I'm done talking, he said, voice flat, tired. The facts are right in front of you. I know what you did. And now you're going to face the consequences. A thick, suffocating silence followed. And then, my brother laughed. A short, humorless sound, sharp with disbelief. Consequences, he scoffed, shaking his head. What are you going to do? Cut me off. I'll be fine, Dad. You think I need your money? My father didn't react. He just watched him, expression unreadable. Oh, I know you need it. That smirk on my brother's face faltered. Without a word, my father reached for the will, the single document that held the power to decide everything. He turned it over in his hands, almost as if weighing its significance, before finally setting it down in front of me. Every last cent I have, he said, his voice steady, is going to him. The room froze. For a split second, I thought I had misheard. I blinked, my eyes locked on the papers in front of me, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. My brother, however, had no trouble understanding. He shot to his feet so fast that his chair nearly toppled over. What? My father didn't even flinch. You heard me. No. No, this is a joke, right? My brother's voice cracked, panic creeping in. His wife's head snapped toward him, her nails digging into his arm. You can't do this, she hissed. My father raised an eyebrow. Can't I? My brother slammed his hand down on the table, his face twisting with rage. You can't just take everything and give it to him. His eyes burned as he turned to me. He doesn't deserve it. I tilted my head, studying him. Why? I asked, voice calm. Because I didn't steal it from you first. His jaw clenched. His wife shook her head furiously, her perfectly composed facade beginning to crack. We'll fight this, she snapped. We'll get a lawyer. My father leaned back, unbothered. You're welcome to try, he said coolly. But you won't win. And that was it. For the first time, I saw it, the empire my brother had built on lies and stolen wealth was collapsing around him. And this time, there was nothing he could do to stop it. I sat back in my chair, watching as the panic settled into their faces. For years, I had believed that justice was a myth. That I would spend the rest of my life knowing they had taken everything from me and walked away unscathed. But now, the tables had turned. And for the first time in a long, long time, I felt free. The silence after my father's words was thick, suffocating. My brother stood frozen, his body rigid with disbelief, while his wife's hand clutched his arms so tightly her knuckles turned white. This isn't happening, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But it was happening. For the first time in his life, my brother wasn't getting what he wanted. And he couldn't handle it. Dad, you can't be serious, my brother finally spoke, his voice raw, dangerously close to desperation. You're really going to throw me away? Your own son. My father exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his forehead. For a brief moment, he looked tired. Tired in a way I had never seen before. But when he spoke, his voice was as steady as ever. You threw yourself away the moment you decided to betray this family, he said. You made your choices. Now, you live with them. My brother shook his head violently. No. No, this isn't right." He turned to me, his eyes burning with resentment. "You think you deserve this?" His voice was sharp, accusatory. "You're nothing. You've always been nothing. And Dad's just doing this to punish me." I let out a slow breath, meeting his glare with calm indifference. "If that's what helps you sleep at night." And then his wife snapped. Her hands slammed against the table, her composure finally shattering. "Enough," she screamed. "You think you can just take everything from us? You think we're going to walk away with nothing?" My father's gaze hardened. "That's exactly what I think." I watched as the realization finally hit them. For years, my brother had lived in luxury. Everything had been handed to him, and he had never once had to struggle, never once had to face the weight of his own mistakes. But now, he was facing nothing. And for the first time, he had no way out. "This isn't over," my brother hissed, his voice shaking with barely restrained rage. "I swear to God, I'll fight this." My father didn't so much as blink. He simply nodded, utterly unfazed. "Then you'll waste whatever little money you have left on lawyers who will tell you the same thing I just did." His voice remained cool, steady. "You have nothing." I saw the veins in my brother's neck bulging, his hands clenched into trembling fists. His wife looked just as wrecked, her breathing uneven, her perfectly manicured nails digging so hard into her palm I thought she might draw blood. They had built their entire lives on stealing. Stealing from me. Stealing from my father. Stealing from my mother. And now, there was nothing left for them to take. The satisfaction coursing through me was impossible to put into words. Then my father slowly stood, his presence commanding the room the way only he could. "There's one more thing," he said. I watched as my brother swallowed, dread flickering behind his eyes. He knew, whatever was coming next wasn't going to be good. My father pulled out another document, setting it down on the table with deliberate care. "These are copies of the financial transactions. The ones proving you stole from me." My brother didn't move. He barely even breathed. "If you fight this," my father continued, his voice quiet but firm, "I will take them to the authorities." He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "And you will spend the rest of your life paying for what you've done." My brother's face drained of color. His wife gasped, turning to him with wide, panicked eyes. "Wait, what?" she whispered, grabbing his arm. "Tell me he's lying." He didn't answer. Because he couldn't. My father crossed his arms. "So here's your choice," he said. "You can leave here right now, accept that you've lost, and never come back." He leaned forward slightly, his next words like a knife through the tension in the room. "Or, you can fight me. And I will make sure you regret it." The threat lingered, thick and heavy, like a storm about to break. And then, for the first time, my brother broke. His shoulders sagged, the fire in his eyes dying out. He knew. He had lost. His wife, however, wasn't ready to surrender. "We'll take legal action." "Shut up." My brother cut her off, his voice hollow, defeated. She recoiled as if he had struck her. "Excuse me." He didn't even look at her. "Just shut up." My father exhaled, shaking his head. "That's what I thought." Without another word, my brother pushed back from the table and stood. His movements were slow, heavy, like a man who had aged 10 years in just a few minutes. His wife stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "That's it?" she demanded. "You're just going to take this?" He didn't answer. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You're a joke." I saw it then, something flickered in his expression. A mix of hurt. Of shame. But he didn't argue. Because deep down, he knew. This was the end. My father reached for his glass of water, took a slow sip, and then, without a hint of hesitation, nodded toward the door. You can leave now. My brother clenched his jaw, his entire body rigid with anger. But he didn't argue. He didn't fight. Instead, he turned and walked away. His wife scrambled after him, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. I let out a slow breath, feeling something inside me unravel. For years, I had carried the weight of their betrayal. For years, I had told myself that justice didn't exist. That they would always win. That they would always land on their feet. But now, I was the one standing tall. And as they walked out that door, I knew I would never have to look back. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the house like the final nail in a coffin. My brother and his wife were gone. For good. I sat there, staring at the empty space where they had been, feeling something settle over me. It wasn't just relief. It was freedom. For years, I had lived under the crushing weight of what they had done to me. The betrayal. The humiliation. The injustice. And now, that weight was gone. It had consumed me, eaten away at me in ways I hadn't even recognized until this moment. I had told myself that time had healed my wounds, that I had moved on. But it wasn't time that healed me. It was justice. And justice had just been served. I exhaled slowly, turning to my father. He was still seated, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, his face unreadable. The strength in his posture was still there, but so was something else. Fatigue. 3 months. That was all the time we had left. My throat tightened. Dad. He looked at me then, his eyes softer than before. You did well, he said simply. I let out a hollow laugh. I didn't do anything. He shook his head. You didn't lose yourself. Not like he did. I frowned. I almost did. He nodded, like he had always known that. I glanced toward the door, my mind still replaying the look on my brother's face when he realized it was over. For so long, he had been untouchable. The golden child. The one who always landed on his feet. But now, his world was crumbling, and I had no intention of stopping it. The fallout begins. The first cracks appeared within a week. It started with the money, or rather, the lack of it. Without my father's financial backing, my brother was in trouble almost immediately. The house, the cars, the extravagant lifestyle he and his wife had built hadn't been sustained by hard work. They had been sustained by handouts. And now, the handouts were gone. The first call came 3 days later. I let it ring. Then another. Ignored it. By the 4th day, he switched tactics. A message. We need to talk. No explanation. No apology. Just 4 meaningless words. I deleted it. Cracks in the perfect marriage. A week later, my father and I were having lunch when the first real update came in. His lawyer had called. My brother's wife had tried to contest the will. Tried. And failed. The look on my father's face when he heard was one of pure amusement. She really thought that would work. I smirked. She never could accept reality. And now, reality was crashing down around her. It wasn't just the money, it was public perception. For years, my brother and his wife had built their identity on wealth, status, and power. They flaunted it online, bragged about it to their friends, carried themselves like they were untouchable. Now, people were watching them crumble. And as the money dried up, so did their marriage. 2 weeks after the will was finalized, I got another message. This time, from her. He's ruining us. Do you really want to see your own brother like this? I stared at the words, letting them sink in. Ruining us. Not ruining himself. Ruining them. Because, of course, in her mind, this was never about his mistakes, never about their choices. It was always about who was left to blame. And for the first time, she was realizing the truth. My brother had nothing left to offer. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. The collapse. By the time a month had passed, my brother was unrecognizable. The company he worked for, the one my father had helped him get into, let him go. His financial mess had made headlines, and it turned out that executives didn't take too kindly to fraud when it was splashed across legal documents. His wife. She left him. I don't know when or how, but one day, she was just gone. She deleted her social media, cut ties with mutual friends, and disappeared into whatever hole she had crawled out of. And my brother? He was alone. The last message he sent me came exactly 5 weeks after that day at my father's house. Are you happy now? I stared at the screen for a long time. I thought about everything. The betrayal. The years of pain. The anger. The nights I spent wondering why I was the one who lost everything. And now, looking at his message, I realized something. I wasn't happy. Because happiness had nothing to do with him anymore. I had my father. I had my peace. I had my freedom. So instead of replying, I did the one thing I should have done years ago. I deleted the message. And I moved on. I deleted his number. And I moved on. The storm didn't just hit my brother's life, it devastated it. Over the next few months, I watched from a distance as everything he had built on lies and stolen opportunities collapsed. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel pity for him. Because the truth was, he did this to himself. The financial freefall. My brother had always lived a life of excess. Lavish vacations, designer suits, first-class flights. He was the type of man who never checked price tags because he never had to. Until now. Without my father's financial backing, he was drowning. The house, the mansion, was the first to go. The bank seized it before he even had a chance to fight back. Turns out, living on credit and empty promises only works when you have someone else's money propping you up. Then came the cars. The ones he had driven just to show off. The ones he had posted online, captioning them with, "Success isn't given. It's earned." Now. Gone. Repossession notices. Frozen accounts. A rapid descent from power to nothingness. And the best part? It was all public. The same social circles that once worshipped him were now whispering behind his back. The same people who had toasted champagne with him were now laughing at his downfall. And he couldn't stand it. The divorce. But his biggest loss? Her. His golden trophy. My ex-wife. The woman he had stolen from me, convinced that life would be better with her by his side. She had stuck around for as long as she could. Maybe she thought the money would magically reappear. Maybe she assumed my father would change his mind and fix everything. But when the reality of being broke sank in, so did she. One day, she was there, demanding solutions, pushing my brother to do something. And the next. She was gone. Left him just as easily as she had left me. No warning. No farewell. Just, disappearance. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned she had moved out and filed for divorce within weeks. Took whatever small assets she could claim and vanished into a new life. She had bet on the wrong man. And now, she was looking for someone else to save her. But my brother? He had nothing left to offer. Rock bottom. 3 months after my father cut him off, my brother hit his lowest point. I heard the rumors. How he was desperately trying to borrow money from anyone who would listen. How he had started selling everything he still owned just to pay off debts. How no one, not a single person, wanted to help him. The mighty had fallen. And no one cared. Then, one evening, I got a call. A number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Then another. Then a text. Please. Just pick up. I stared at the screen for a long time. I knew exactly who it was. And I knew exactly what he wanted. Money. A second chance. A lifeline. And for a split second, I felt something. Not guilt. Not sympathy. But a strange, distant sadness. Because once upon a time, before all of this, he had been my brother. And I had loved him. But that was a lifetime ago. So instead of responding, I did the one thing I should have done years ago. I deleted the message. And I never looked back. The funeral. The day of my father's funeral arrived beneath a gray, overcast sky, as if the world itself was mourning. The past few months had been a whirlwind. Watching my brother's downfall. Finalizing legal matters. And most importantly, spending every moment I could with my father. I had done my best to make his last days peaceful. We sat together in the evenings, reminiscing about old stories. He never spoke much about my brother after the will was finalized. He had made his decision. And he had no regrets. His focus was on me. On making sure I was ready to carry on the family legacy. And then, just like that, he was gone. I stood by his grave, my hands clenched at my sides as the priest spoke, his voice a dull hum in the background. The funeral was small, just family, a few close friends, and business associates who had respected my father. It was quiet, somber, the kind of farewell he would have wanted. But I knew there was one presence I had been dreading. And then, I saw him. My brother. He stood a few yards away, not close enough to be part of the gathering, but not far enough to be ignored. He looked like a ghost of the man he used to be. The expensive suits, the polished arrogance, all of it was gone. In its place was something much more modest. His hair, once always perfectly styled, was unkempt. He had lost weight. And for the first time in our lives, he looked truly alone. I turned back toward the casket, inhaling sharply as it was lowered into the ground. My father had always been my anchor, my quiet source of strength. And now, I had to face the world without him. When the service ended, people began to drift away, offering their condolences before departing. I kept my gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge my brother's presence. But I knew he was waiting. And sure enough, as soon as the crowd had thinned, I heard his voice. We need to talk. I closed my eyes briefly before turning to face him. There's nothing left to say. He hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. I didn't think he would actually cut me off. His voice was raw, almost hoarse. I thought he was bluffing. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. That's the problem. You never thought anything through. You always assumed someone would be there to clean up your mess. His jaw clenched. You don't understand how hard things have been. A bitter laugh escaped me. Hard? I took a step toward him. Hard as losing everything because of you. Hard as trying to rebuild my life from nothing while you lived in luxury. Hard as burying the only parent who still cared about me while you stood at a distance, too much of a coward to even say goodbye to him. He flinched, his shoulders sagging. I know, he muttered. I cut him off before he could say anything else. There's no apology that fixes this. He swallowed hard, looking down at the ground. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I stared at him for a long moment. I could see it now, the regret, the loss. It was real. But it didn't matter anymore. Some wounds don't heal. Some betrayals can't be undone. I took a slow breath and looked him in the eyes one last time. Goodbye. And then, I walked away. I didn't look back. And for the first time in 4 years, I felt free. Moving forward. The weeks following my father's funeral were quieter than I had expected. No more tense conversations. No more unexpected phone calls. No more looming presence of my brother, trying to claw his way back into my life. It was just me now. And for the first time in years, I wasn't living in someone else's shadow. I spent most of my time at my father's house, the house that was now mine. It still felt strange, walking through the halls of my childhood, knowing that everything here belonged to me alone. For so long, I had been the forgotten son. The one left behind while my brother took center stage. Now, it was his turn to disappear. I hadn't heard from him since the funeral. Part of me wondered if he had finally accepted that there was no way back, that the damage he had done was irreparable. Or maybe he had just given up. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. Because I had no intention of looking for him. Instead, I focused on rebuilding. Not just my father's estate, but my own peace of mind. At first, it was difficult being in the house alone. Every room held memories. Echoes of the past whispering through the walls. My mother's old reading chair by the fireplace. My father's study, where I used to watch him work late into the night. The dining room, where so many family dinners had taken place before it all fell apart. But little by little, I started making it mine. I redecorated. Replaced old furniture. Cleared out things that no longer held meaning, keeping only what truly mattered. It was my home now. And for the first time, I could breathe. Letting go of the past. One afternoon, as I sorted through my father's belongings, I came across a photo album I hadn't seen in years. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I was ready to face what lay inside. But as I flipped through the pages, something unexpected happened. I smiled. There we were. My father. My mother. Me. Long before the betrayals. Before the bitterness. Before my brother stole something that was never his to take. The photographs reminded me that there had been good times. That my entire life hadn't been shaped by loss. And that realization. It was freeing. Because for the longest time, I had let anger define me. I had carried it with me like armor, convinced that it was the only thing keeping me going. But I didn't have to anymore. A future of my own. With the estate settled, I finally allowed myself to think about what came next. For so long, I had been trapped in the past. What my brother did. What my ex-wife took from me. What I lost. But now. Now, I was in control. I had the resources. The time. And most importantly, the clarity to move forward. And I wasn't going to waste it. I started making plans. Expanding my business. Traveling. Doing all the things I had put on hold while drowning in betrayal. Because this was my life now. And I was ready to start living it. The moment of peace. The sun was setting as I stood on the back porch of my father's house. My house now. The sky stretched endlessly across the horizon, painted in soft hues of orange and pink. The wind carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and for the first time in years, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Peace. The last few months had been a storm. A relentless hurricane of betrayal, loss, and reckoning. But now, as I stood here, staring at the vast land my father had built with his own two hands, I realized something. I had survived. And not just survived. I had won. Not in the way my brother would have defined it. To him, winning had always been about power. About taking from others to elevate himself. But my victory was different. I was free. No more unfinished battles. No more debts to pay. No more ghosts of the past whispering in my ear. I had walked through the fire, endured every loss, and come out the other side, stronger. I had reclaimed myself. That night, I sat at the dining table, sipping a glass of whiskey, reflecting on everything that had led me here. For years, I had lived in the shadow of my brother's betrayal, feeling like a fool for trusting the people who had turned on me so easily. For years, I had questioned if I was too weak. If I had been too blind to see it coming. But now, I realized something. It wasn't my failure. It was theirs. They had destroyed themselves. I had simply endured. A life of my own choosing. For the first time in forever, I wasn't living in reaction to someone else's choices. I wasn't rebuilding my life because of what they had done. I was building it because I wanted to. I had the money, the freedom, and the clarity to go anywhere. Do anything. The house was mine. The business was thriving. And there was no one left to hold me back. And it felt good. No more looking over my shoulder. No more waiting for the past to catch up with me. No more wondering if my brother would ever change. He wouldn't. And it no longer mattered. The final closure. One morning, I received an email. From him. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. It was short. I lost everything. I don't know where to go from here. If you ever cared about me, even a little, you'll help me. Please. I sat there, rereading the words, waiting to feel something. Anger. Sadness. Regret. But there was nothing. Because I had finally let go. I didn't respond. I simply deleted it. And as I stepped outside into the bright morning sun, feeling its warmth on my skin, I smiled. Because I was finally, truly, free.